Welcome to Boys in the Hood TV. Today we're going to be discussing two 11-8 East Coast Crips who will shoot and kill a fellow East Coast Crip from Q102 known as Day. The morning of June 9th, 2005, Q102 East Coast Crip Day was out and about with two friends, Marquise, also known as Head, and another man known as D, and they all went out to get breakfast that morning. Now later on in the day, they would decide to cruise the streets of LA and smoke weed while riding in Day's van. Now during the cruise, Day would receive a phone call from a man known as White Boy who wanted to meet up to buy some weed. At around 6 p.m., Day pulled up on 48th and Crenshaw Boulevard and parked the van. Now Day at the time was renting two apartments on this block, which he used one of them as a trap spot. Day would get out while D and Head stayed inside the van. Day made his way up to the apartment stairs where he met with White Boy. Moments later, White Boy would leave Day's apartment after buying the weed, and that's when two 11-8 East Coast Crips known as Young Loft and Trey would walk up. Day would then flag both of the men down and tell them to come inside. All three men will proceed to walk inside the apartment before closing the door. Now a few moments later, as the three men stood in the kitchen, Day will then pull out the bag of weed, and that's when Young Loft pulled out the gun and opened fire. Day would be hit multiple times as he fell against the kitchen wall. Both Loft and Trey would then run out of the apartment and flee the scene. Now Day's friends who were still inside the van heard the shots. That's when both Head and D would get out and run up to the apartment and see Day on the kitchen floor bleeding. Now before running outside of the apartment, Head would run to Day's closet and steal a leather jacket. Both men would then proceed to call 911 before fleeing the scene inside of Day's van. LAPD would shortly arrive on scene where they would find Day dead on the kitchen floor, still clutching onto his bag of weed in his hand. They would also find a gun in his waistband and about $677 cash in his pockets. It was reported that Day died from multiple gunshot wounds to the right side of his head, right side of his neck, arm, and leg, all through and through. While on scene, officers would retrieve scales, guns, and a book bag full of ecstasy pills. They will also find multiple shell casings inside the kitchen sink, which police would determine that were fired from the same exact gun. Now, as the detectives continued their investigation, they would obtain surveillance footage from the apartment complex, which would show two men entering the apartment and fleeing the scene directly after the shooting. Now, from this footage, officers would be able to identify Trey from the 11-8 East Coast Crips as one of the men that was fleeing the scene. Now, as officers continue to canvass the area, multiple witnesses would come forward, which included neighbors, to tell what they saw. Now, one of the witnesses was White Boy, who would tell police that he saw Young Loft walking up to the stairs as he left Day's apartment not long before. Now, after collecting this evidence, detectives would present this case to the DA, and eventually they will get the go-ahead to issue warrants for the rest of Loft and Trey. Now, once both men were in custody, during questioning, detectives would try to pit both Loft and Trey against each other. They would tell each man that the other had snitched on the other. Now, during their questioning with Trey, they would also insinuate that both Trey and Loft were paid to kill Day in a hit. Now, after questioning, both men were placed in a cell together along with a recording device. Now, while in the cell, both Loft and Trey would get into an argument, accusing the other of talking to the police. Loft would tell Trey, "All you have to do is be quiet, man." And Trey would respond that he didn't say anything, that the only thing he told the police was that they had only went there to buy some weed from Day, and that there was somebody else in the bathroom at the time who came out and shot Day. Now, Loft would tell Trey that he had already ran across some Q102 Crips while in county. He was going to state that he wasn't worried about what they was talking about as long as they wasn't trying to trip over the murder of Day. Now, Trey would later reveal he talked to one of Day's homie known as Twin. Now, Twin will go on to tell Trey that he spoke with Baby G from 11-8 East Coast Crips about the murder. He would claim that Baby G gave him and other members of Q102 the green light to get revenge on whoever killed Day. Now, at the time of this conversation, Twin was unaware that Trey was charged with the murder of Day. Now, after finding this out, Loft would then call Baby G from 11-8 scandalous for giving the green light on him. Now, a year later, in 2006, both men would be tried together, and the prosecution would play this jailhouse recording of Loft and Trey discussing the shooting and also talking about the green light from Baby G. The prosecution would then argue that Baby G of 11-8 had hired both Loft and Trey to shoot and kill Day from Q102 to simply take over his drug territory. Now, the prosecution came to this conclusion simply because the day of the murder, Day had not been robbed of any money or drugs or anything from his apartment. And they also believed that Baby G was now tying up loose ends, which is why he gave a green light for the other East Coast Crips to take out both Trey and Loft. But there was no evidence to tie Baby G to this murder. Now, also during the trial, multiple witnesses would come forward to testify. A man named James Garrison, Sylvia Smiles, and Robert Smith, also known as White Boy. Now, Robert Smith, aka White Boy, would take the stand, but he would deny making any statements to the police and deny identifying any other people at the scene of the murder. Now, both Loft and Trey would claim self-defense for this murder. They were going to state that during the drug deal, things went bad, and they had defended themselves against Day. They claimed that Day was high and acting erratic, which led to an altercation. Now, the defense based this information off the toxicology report that came back that showed that Day had marijuana in his system at the time of his death. Now, a gang expert named Officer Fontes would also testify that he had known Loft since 2004, and he, in fact, was a member of the 11-8 East Coast Crips. He would go on to state that he did not know the motives behind this murder, nor could he speak on any green light since he never spoke to Baby G. Now, Day's homeboy, Marquise Addy, aka Lled, would testify that he was with Day the entire day up until his death. He would also admit while inside the apartment, he did take a leather coat from Day's closet, but only to give it to his son. Now, by the end of the trial, both men were found guilty of first-degree murder. Now, Khalik Benz, aka Loft, will be sentenced to 75 years to life in prison, and Trayvon Willis, aka Trey, will be sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. I would like to thank everybody for tapping in, and I'll see y'all next time.